It's an honor for me to share my views on the subject. In this presentation, I will share my understanding about the history of political economy of artificial intelligence and how this understanding of history can actually help us make better decisions when we attempt to Islamize technologies like artificial intelligence. So this is a brief outline of my presentation, and in the first few minutes, I will try to show a blind spot in the contemporary Islamization project, which is going on since a few decades now, and I will go into our own history a little bit to evaluate the route the Islamization project has taken at the moment, which is causing this blind spot. And then I will move to discuss the political economy of the contemporary capitalist world, and I will talk about its historical background and will explain how artificial intelligence as a tool which is further enhancing the influence and power of the modern capitalist institutions. And in this light, I will try to leave the audience with some questions which would be considered by anyone attempting to Islamize modern technologies like artificial intelligence. So today in the Muslim world, we are witnessing this trend of adapting the modern capitalist institutions and inventions to this process of Sharia compliance. And I believe in our attempt to Islamize, we are committing an unintended mistake. And that unintended mistake is to ignore the systemic and political influence of modern institutional framework. And okay, I often use this metaphor to explain the problem which I intend to highlight here as well. Let's imagine for a moment that the horse you see here is sick and dying. So to help the horse, would it be a good idea to take out its body parts and fit them into this machine which resembles a horse, and even take out the skin of the horse and put it over the machine? And so if we do this, will we be able to save the horse like this, or we will just create an illusion that the horse is actually alive? So I think this is what we are doing with Islam today. We are taking out some components from Islamic way of organizing life and putting these components into an alien structure in the name of Sharia compliance. And when we do this to an institutional structure, we also put the term Islamic with it, like Islamic banking, for example, and we then assume that we have taken a step in the direction of reviving Islam in the society. And eventually a time will come when this alien structure will completely transform as per the values and the spirit of Islam. And so maybe on a macro scale, we see bits and pieces of Islam in practice within institutions, but on a macro scale, we can see the parts scattered within an alien mega structure, which may be using these parts for its own advantage in a way which Herbert Marcuse referred to as repressive desublimation. So this brings us to the question that why we are doing this. Why are we so oblivious of the institutional influence, especially the kind of power it holds over the society? And that power, we should take note, is not there to establish the sovereignty of God, but to establish the sovereignty of financial capital, maybe, or some other man-made idea for that matter. Perhaps we are going to engage with artificial intelligence or other contemporary inventions as well in a very similar manner. So what makes us so oblivious and make us take such a route with such superficial attempts toward Islamization that we should be asking with our own selves? And to answer this question, perhaps we need to look at what happened in the Muslim world, for example, in the subcontinent during the colonial period, and especially as an aftermath of the 1857 War of Independence. We perhaps decided that it may be better to avoid any confrontation with our colonial masters. So we accepted their methods of governance, of organizing the society, or running the economy for that matter. Even we adopted their model of education. Quaid-e-Azam Rahmatullah Alayh perhaps understood the problem with the institutional design of Western origin. Like if we listen to his speech on the inauguration of State Bank of Pakistan, we do get a sense that he was trying to highlight the need to develop some alternatives to the economic system at least, but he did not have enough time, nor anyone else was interested to pursue his vision perhaps. So today, after a few generations living within a set of alien institutions, which we often term as the system, which was forcefully imposed upon us by the colonial forces. And as a result, the colonized people, including our ancestors, were held as hostage by these institutions for a long time. And today, after many generations, a significant number of us are not just dependent on these institutions, but we also try to legitimize the authority of these institutions through Sharia compliance. In case you don't know, Stockholm Syndrome refers to the feeling of affection which the prisoner may develop towards their captors. So it appears that the whole Ummah, including us, is suffering from this collective form of Stockholm Syndrome, where we have perhaps fallen in love with those institutions, which may still be allowing the colonial masters to rule us by proxy. So perhaps over the generations, we have developed a kind of affection toward the institutional framework, which by design serves the new imperialist agenda, or by design are meant to establish the sovereignty of the financial capital, for example. And today, we willingly endorse these institutions, even put Islamic with them, as long as these institutions appear to be Sharia compliant. So the Stockholm Syndrome, perhaps, that I just mentioned, is creating a huge blind spot in this movement of Sharia compliance, and that blind spot makes Muslim today obscure to the political influence of modern institutions, including the economic institutions, including the new technologies which are emerging from within these institutions and impacting the world today at an astonishing speed. So there is a dire need to introduce the political economy perspective to the students and scholars involving the Islamization project, so they become conscious of the power which the modern institutions possess to influence the society. And there seems to be a belief that it all depends on intentions and will of the human agency, and devices or institutions or technologies which are used to exercise human agency and do not have much of an influence on what we think and do. Can a car fly if the driver is a pilot? And if I ask this question from anyone, the answer I'm going to get is obviously that no cars will not be able to fly even if the driver is a pilot, simply because the structure of the car is not designed to fly. Same is the case with institutions, as they also put constraints on human behavior, no matter what their intentions may be. Institutions are primarily structures of rules which exercise power in at least two ways. First, they divert behavior of employees towards some desired output through a mechanism of reward and punishment. And secondly, they add up output of each employee to generate a cumulative output. Individuals working within these institutions have little control on how their individual outputs will be utilized by the institutions they are a part of. To explain the difference between the structure and in the agency, Noam Chomsky once said that you might be the nicest person, but if the institution you are working for is a monster, you also become a monster. When I mention the term institutional structure, I do not merely mean a bank or a university or a hospital. I refer to the entire hierarchy of various institutions on local and international level, which reinforces a discipline on each other to ensure that institutions keep performing as they are designed. Banks, for example, reports to the central banks, and the central banks are supposed to follow the standards of the international financial regulators. Likewise, hospitals are under the health ministry, and on an international level, we have organizations like WHO, and hospitals are also connected to the pharmaceutical industry, and universities on a horizontal plane. And the whole system today operates very much like a machine, where each component of the machine puts constraints on the operations of the other parts of the machine. So now let us come to the question on a very basic level: what purpose modern institutional structures actually serve? And to answer this question, we may want to first look at the changes in the basic idea of human nature in the 15th and 16th century in Europe. René Descartes established that human beings are rational and capable of objective thinking. However, human beings also had an irrational, subjective, or emotional side as well. Thomas Hobbes later also established that human beings are essentially selfish, therefore untrustworthy, therefore they need to be controlled in order to be protected from one another. And this idea about human nature was endorsed by nearly every famous thinker and intellectual in Western history. Ayn Rand perhaps is the last famous example in this context. To cut the long story short, the rational and objective side of human beings was eventually seen as superior, and the irrational, subjective, or emotional side of human beings was seen as inferior, but also inseparable part of human beings. So to protect human beings from their own irrational or subjective side, an institutional order emerged in Europe which favored the rational or objective side of human nature, but tried to remove their irrational or subjective side. So the primary aim of the modern institutional structure has been to eliminate the human subjectivity to exercise any influence in the process of achieving any institutional goal. And if it is not possible to eliminate, then it must be manipulated to achieve the institutional goals. However, if we compare this European development with how we see human nature in Islamic thought and history, it is not hard to see the contrast. The human subject was not seen negatively in Islamic history, except in one case when Ottomans established a military bureaucracy to prevent nepotism. Other than that, we do not see any obvious examples in Islamic history where human subjectivity is seen as problematic. Rather, it is integrated into the Islamic way of life. But on the other side, in Europe, perhaps it was perpetual conflict between countries and between different groups within society, which led some intellectuals in Europe to believe that human beings are by default selfish and trustworthy unless proven otherwise. Therefore, we need rational structures of power to minimize the destructive influence of the subjective part of human beings. So apart from the possibility of conflict, human subjectivity was perceived in Europe to be causing another problem. That is to make human beings unpredictable. This was a serious problem for the capitalist class as their returns on investment became uncertain if the behavior of the workers and the consumers and the society in general could not be predicted in advance. So this was the time when world of physics already had shown that behavior of physical matter could be predicted. So likewise, it was believed that it is still believed that the behavior of societies and markets can also be predicted if we understand what mathematical laws govern them. So any possibility of social disturbance and subsequent market crash could be predicted in advance. So this leads to the idea of collecting statistical data so that if any pattern of behavior is observed in the data, a mathematical function can then be developed. And using the mathematical function, the behavior of the public can be predicted in advance. And thus, necessary measures can be taken to prevent any unwanted behavior which may threaten the long-term investments of the capitalist class. So now in this context, if we see the recent evolution of power, we see the power is gradually being shifted to institutions which have a greater ability to control and manipulate human subjectivity and divert it towards certain so-called rational goals like increasing productivity or to maximize financial capital. So 100 years back or more, we see British Empire ruling much of the world in competition and colonial ambitions over the nations in Europe like Spain and France. And then in the next 50 years or so, we had many nations emerging on the map of the world which could manipulate citizens using the ideas like patriotism. And the purpose has been to channel human subjectivity towards the goals of the state, and most importantly, to increase productivity measured in GDP ever since. And immediately afterwards, the world divided itself into two blocks, one on the side of capitalism led by the US, while the other on the side of communism led by USSR. And capitalism then won over communism, perhaps because it had developed better mechanisms to manipulate human subjectivity. In other words, we had all these multinational corporations emerging as victors of the Cold War, which eventually accumulated greater power to manipulate human subjectivity. And the so-called MNCs perhaps had the greatest amount of economic data and knowledge about the consumer preferences, which perhaps made MNCs more powerful, in many cases more powerful than the nation states. And now in the last 20 years, we have seen the rise of few tech companies which perhaps possess data about their users more than anyone else in entire human history, and therefore possess the greatest capability to predict and manipulate the human subjectivity for their advantage. So now tech companies have perhaps more power than their traditional brick and mortar firms by virtue of the data they actually have. And while the state institutions or corporations attempted to predict, control, and manipulate human subjectivity on a macro scale, the internal structure of MNCs also turned more and more like machines, and reducing the need of human labor from the production to an extent that fully automated production units are very much a reality today. Muscle power has been completely replaced with machines now in perhaps most mega corporations. However, up until recently, there was no alternative to replace human brain. So now artificial intelligence come into the picture, which appears to possess an ever-increasing capacity to replace human brain, at least for the task of routine nature. So if the AI keep advancing like it is now, it is possible that the human subject may become completely eliminated from within the state and market institutions in perhaps a few decades from now. Harari has even predicted that the project to eliminate human subjectivity will proceed toward eliminating subjectivity even from within human beings with technological hacks which can, for example, eliminate fear from our minds and produce emotions on demand through some implants in our brains. Wearable tags which claim to do that, that is already in market for sale today. And such brain hacking technology is being presented as a step up in the process of human evolution, and the era of technologically enhanced individual is being referred to as the era of transhumanism. And by rejecting human subjectivity, there has been a huge downside. And Carl Jung in the West and Iqbal in our own history has acknowledged almost a century ago that modern man is facing a psychological and spiritual crisis because of the rejection of his own subjectivity. And for that, the modern man has even created an institutional structure for that purpose. And when it is not possible to eliminate subjectivity, then the institutional structure tries their best to predict, manipulate, and control human subjectivity for outcomes which are referred by the modern man as rational, like perpetual growth in wealth and power. But according to Carl Jung, the modern man keeps paying a huge price of such a repressive desublimation in the form of an epidemic of mental illness and life dissatisfaction. Gabor Mate more recently also suggested that there is an epidemic of psychological trauma which is ravaging the developed part of the world. Capitalism is a kind of a system which profits immensely from the problem which itself creates, and the dissatisfaction of the modern man has already become a multi-trillion-dollar industry which attempts to make the modern man addicted to products or services, including social media, which temporarily takes away his pain but never address the root cause. So social media giants, for example, today are able to collect huge amount of data of their users, and for that matter have deliberately attempted to make the users addictive as well for the same purpose. So much so that financial valuation of tech companies is done now on the basis of how much data they have about their users, not how much net profit they actually make. The data these companies collect is then again utilized to further increase the addiction of their users as well. And so the data is now also the new currency in the financial market. So the more human subjectivity is rejected or manipulated in the modern society, the more the population feels dissatisfied with their lives, the more likely they can get addicted to various online platforms. So they will bring in more data for these tech companies, and more data means more financial value. And more data also means that the company can use the data to develop more powerful and effective AI to further replace human subject from the system or to manipulate them for the system's advantage. It appears like a vicious cycle. So artificial intelligence is being sold or will be sold to the public under the pretext of convenience. And in the name of convenience, the public who is already addicted to the services offered by many tech companies may also end up becoming more and more dependent on the same companies who own these siren servers. Jaron Lanier, who's a Microsoft employee, is a best-selling author as well. He argues that bigger the capacity of these servers owned by a company, the bigger the capacity of the company to exercise some form of control. And of course, it requires billions of dollars of investment to achieve that. So to take part and get ahead in the game of making people addicted in very large numbers to get their data, one must attract the investment from those who can invest billions of dollars. And when we do that, we also have to buy in the vision of the investors. And the investor could be a VC firm, a venture capitalist firm on the Wall Street, or it could be US government, or perhaps some authority in China for that matter. So where does that all lead us to? It perhaps lead us towards creation of a digital panopticon, a kind of an invisible prison where the system would know in advance and can prevent people to do anything against the system, even if it becomes necessary. Harari has been predicting that we are gradually moving into this era of digital dictatorships, where the first time in history of humanity, the potential dictators can have more information about us than we have about our lives. And the digital dictatorships can be seen essentially as dictatorship of the capital, as without capital, it is not possible to establish the technological infrastructure which is needed to collect, store, process all the data which gives power to these digital dictators. So what do we make out from all of this? Where do we fit in our Sharia compliance mindset in the picture just presented here? So I think we should really become conscious of the Stockholm syndrome, which as a society we are experiencing and realize this invisible prison, a panopticon, in terms of Jeremy Bentham, we are living in. And this panopticon, this prison is quickly turning digital now, and it is perpetuating very quickly by selling itself as a form of entertainment and promise us freedom, ease, and convenience. But in reality, it is strapping us into an invisible prison to eradicate the collective influence of human subjectivity from the society altogether. So perhaps before opting the Sharia compliant approach here, we should really ask ourselves first that do we want to cripple ourselves on the subjective and emotional levels and live our lives more like machines, or while being manipulated by the machines, and machines which were created by a civilization which has a bias against the subject? Do we want to encourage outsourcing of our social roles to be performed by systems driven by artificial intelligence? And do we want to replace human-to-human connection with digitally regulated relationships? And finally, we should ask ourselves, do we want to participate in this game, which is adding to the sovereignty of financial capital on the entire planet? Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much. This is all from my side.